You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and in this edition, we are going to be fixing RTD-2 so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm John.
I am Matt.
So we had to do a fixing RTD-2 episode after the other fixing episodes we've done, but this really is way, way, way too recent to say, oh, we shouldn't have done that. Things have moved on in society since that was an acceptable thing to do, even more so than when we did the Chris Chibnall episode. So what I've got instead is, fandom kind of built RTD up as the savior of Doctor Who after a Chris Chibnall era that they found too dull, only too dull and too woke. And then RTD turned up, and not only was he even more woke, but he was also actually oddly, I don't know if duller is the word, but certainly I don't think he came
No.
back in and rescued Doctor Who in the way that people hoped he would. And so actually, I hadn't done any prep for this. And today I went online and just typed in what was wrong with RTD2 or something along those lines and read about 4 or 5 different articles or web posts or whatever and made a list of the sort of things that came up most commonly amongst the complaints about it. And so we'll go through
Kenny
those.
Baker's alcoholism turned up.
We'll go through those and as well as saying whether I guess we think they were the wrong thing to do, also we maybe say how we think they might have been avoided if we do think there were mistakes. I guess because so this is, I think, probably going to be my contention for this is that as we know, especially having Dylan in our WhatsApp thread and on our podcast, right? Television, a lot of television is putting out fires. And you must know when you go into making something that you're going to be putting out fires. But it felt like Bad Wolf and RTD came in a bit high on their own supply, a bit stoked by their own egos. And it felt like they came in expecting not to make mistakes. And therefore, when things didn't go quite to plan, I don't think they put the fires out particularly well always. And so I guess we'll dig into that. I just want to point this out before we start. So this is such received fan wisdom that the 2 series were recorded back to back. And I've said this before, they were not recorded back to back. There was a break in between of 3 months and a week, as there was between, every season in the RTD1. But in looking up the dates, I've realized that the thing that probably makes people not realize that there was a gap in between is that they started shooting the first series of Shooter Gatwa and they finished shooting the second series of Shooter Gatwa in much less time than, say, you would have done between 2 Tennant seasons. And that is because during the RTD1 era, they were shooting for 9 months and took 3 months off. And then they were shooting for 9 months and took 3 months off. And so they would start shooting at the same time every year. But actually, here, you've got a case where the first season started shooting in December and the second season started shooting the following October, which makes it look like they didn't take a break. But the truth is, they shot for 7 months instead of 9 before taking 3 months off. And so I wonder if the whole of the problems with RTD2 might have come down to the fact, not the whole of the problems, but a large part of the perceived problems of RTD2 comes down to the fact that they cast a doctor who was under contract to another program, didn't take into account the fact that he might not get out of that program at a particular time, and built the entire shooting schedule around an actor who subsequently proved not to be available. So you've kind of got a case of, and I've said this before, and I fully believe this. I think those 2 Dr. Light episodes in the first season were last minute rewrites by RTD to replace scripts by other writers that fell through because Shooty Gatwa wasn't going to be able to make them because he was still doing sex education. I don't know. What do you two think about the idea that there was just a little bit too much hubris going in, that these people had made Doctor Who before and that they were convinced that they could just step up and do it again?
I'd push back against most of what you've been saying, apart from the break between the 2 series, because I can't
That's a
argue
factual
against that.
base.
I
Yeah.
think So in my view, I don't think they really made that many mistakes. I think pretty much apart from with obvious changes of key members or key cast members and having to rewrite around that, I feel like they got on screen what they intended to get on screen in the way that they intended to get it. It didn't feel to me like it was a mess or it was choppy or even Ncuti Gatwa was absent. I think they kind of, if I was just watching it not knowing that he hadn't turned up for the first day of shooting or whatever, I probably wouldn't have noticed. I
But
think
if but
yeah,
if what they put on screen is what they intended to put on screen, but it's just rubbish and nobody likes it, isn't that in itself the mistake?
but 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 what I think is I don't think it's rubbish.
Yeah, I'm not saying
And
that it
I
is, but
think people did like it. I think the problem is television had changed, and they
well,
perhaps either didn't change with it, or there wasn't a way of changing with it. Maybe the format itself wasn't appropriate for television at the time, which you can't deal with. The other thing I want to say is
but
I
just on
think
that, because I think
yeah,
that's an interesting point. But Chris
yeah.
Chibnall did change the format, and they changed it back, didn't they?
Well,
I know
he didn't.
Flux was an
He didn't
accidental.
really. Yeah, but he didn't really change. Flux isn't really like a one-story miniseries. It's just a standard series with stories that occasionally kind of. I mean,
Ooh,
basically, it's the X Files. It's more old-fashioned than the reboot of Doctor Who. The
I
X Files
don't
was the
think
same.
that's
Buffy was the
true.
same.
If you watch the Sontaran one, there's a lot in that actually feeds into the overall story rather than the Sontaran
Yeah, but if
story.
you watched an X Files series, that's exactly what they did in the X Files. So a third of the episodes are arc storylines, and the rest are standalones. So all Flux is just the X Files, and the X Files is late '90s television.
But none of Flux though could stand alone. None of those six episodes could
Oh
stand alone.
well, um,
Yeah, they could.
um
Yeah, they
yeah,
could.
yeah.
Rewritten considerably, they could stand alone. But as they
Or
stand,
easy. Some of War of the Sontarans or Village of Angels really easily would.
no, a lot of much. I rewatched War of the Sontarans for another podcast a
So
few weeks ago, and there's an awful lot of it that doesn't stand alone from the rest of Flux.
so but I don't think that is. I mean, I don't think that's as groundbreaking as it seems because there's bits of the X Files and maybe there's bits of
I'm not saying
another
it's
series to it.
groundbreaking.
Well, I don't think it's a format thing though. I don't think making television in 40 to 50-minute chunks telling either individual stories per episode or arc stories for the whole story for the whole series. I don't think that's the issue. I think there's more about the way that Doctor Who is perceived, the way it's marketed, the sort of the general. I don't know. I mean, if I did know, then I would get a job show running Doctor Who for the modern television landscape. I just don't. I just don't. I don't think this was the time for Doctor Who. But what I do think is, I agree that Russell T Davies is arrogant, but with reason, and I think arrogance is required to a certain level to make the sort of television that Russell T to operate in the area that Russell T Davies operates in, and the same with the producers, and the same with anybody making it. I mean, look at Dylan. Arrogance is a required quality to be in the entertainment industry because you have to assume that what you're helping make or what you're making is what people want. Um, and I think Russell T Davies has a good call for being arrogant, and fans had a good reason for thinking that he would sort of re-energize Doctor Who because he'd done it before back in 2005. So there's sort of
Okay,
proof. However, I think possibly he wasn't right for the time, and the time wasn't right for the series, and the series wasn't quite right for the time. And I think that's the issue, not what went up on screen, not what the attitude of Russell T Davies
okay.
was.
I'm going to ask John then, but Matt, maybe for the sake of this podcast, do me a favor and engage with the idea that some things might have been done better for the next
Well,
50
I will, but I
minutes.
do think some things, as with all of Doctor Who, I think some things could have been done better, but I don't think they would have helped with viewership. That's my point. I
Well,
think they would have
maybe.
helped in other matters. I think Russell T Davies undoubtedly got things wrong.
Well, nevertheless, I've got this list and we'll go through it.
I mean, he killed a cat. That's the main thing I remember him getting wrong. You just don't kill it. It's a brutal thing to do.
John.
I think the problem with looking at RTD and hubris is RTD is always going to be like Stanley. He's going to, he's going to front up. He's never going to let you know what was kind of the dirty bits that, go on behind the camera. So he's always going to look arrogant to a certain degree because he's always out there selling what he's made. He's very, very good at that.
That's not the issue, though, is it?
But
because yes,
yeah,
you do
but
have to
that's
sell it. Yeah.
It's just the impression that people get of him because he is the big personality who goes out and will, or he will not really say a bad word about people who worked on the show. I think the closest they ever did got was that one interview with Clive Swift.
Yeah, I don't think that's the issue. Because yes, if you're making the show, you have to promote the show, and you're not going to say, "Oh shit, this episode didn't work." But I think the issue is after two other different showrunners, RTD didn't let it naturally go to another showrunner. He put his own name forwards to come back and make Doctor Who again. And,
Possibly, but who were the other options? That's the thing.
well, there would have been.
Was it a choice between
options.
him or yes? But who? Do we have any concrete examples? That's the one thing.
Well, we do know various people went in for interviews while Stephen Moffat was thinking of leaving, and those names were still on the table after Chris Chibnall, so it could have been one of those, and we know who some of those names were. So there were definitely other names in the hat.
But Chris Chibnall was under the impression that he was going to have to leave that ending open for Power of the Doctor. So he didn't know what was coming next. Which
well, he didn't.
Does suggest otherwise, before there's always been that kind of natural succession. You know who's coming in.
But it's almost also, but before it's always been the case, has it not, that when one producer showrunner comes to an end, there's a point where the series might just get rested, and then somebody grudgingly steps in. Stephen Moffat grudgingly steps in. And presumably, it's not just people who've been interviewed for the role. It's who would be enough to get Bad Wolf, Disney, the BBC on board. And maybe Russell T Davies was the only person. He was the obvious person to actually get Doctor Who made at that time.
But the point is, we know that he put his own name forwards.
And the thing is, yes, I would agree there's who is because the only real popular success Russell T Davies has had is that version of Doctor Who from 2005. The rest of it, yes, he's had a lot of critically acclaimed stuff, but it's on lower rating channels. It's on stuff that gets it gets the right people talking to make a big splash publicly.
And a lot of his stuff on the major channels in prime time hasn't actually done, especially. He has had successes, but a lot of his stuff, like Mine on Mine, was a dismal failure.
Years and years.
Yeah.
Again, low ratings. A Very English Scandal. I don't think they're rated particularly high, but again, it got people talking.
Yeah, it did okay, but it wasn't like a smash hit or anything. No. Yeah, his only smash hit is Doctor Who. Let's get into some of these areas. I've got quite a long list, actually, about a dozen or so items, but some of them come under the same sort of thing, and they're the same conversations. One thing that we can't escape talking about and so this is not RTD, but this is to do with the RTD era, was getting in bed with Disney Plus a mistake? Because
they had to have a co-production, and who was there to give them the money for the co-production is the question.
Well, the way BBC Studios were running it, they didn't have to have a co-production because it was ticking along quite nicely with them getting money from various different places and ploughing that into the program. They decided to boot that into touch and get into bed with the streamer. That was the BBC, not Bad Wolf, that made that decision. And they seem to have made the Disney Plus decision without much thought as to what if nothing goes the way we're hoping it will. And at the time that decision was made, crucially, we were still undergoing lockdowns. And so there was still a massive amount of people furloughed or spending more time at home than they normally would and spending more money on streaming services. And that's the bubble that burst. The streaming bubble has not burst. the lockdown bubble burst. In other words, people being locked down made them go for more streamers. And so that's collapsed to an extent. But nobody seems to have had the foresight at the time of the Disney Plus deal. And this is Disney Plus's side as well, that actually this might not continue, that once the lockdown stopped, the subscriber numbers might not expand to the degree that they had been expanding.
I'd imagine Disney feel that it was a mistake. But I can't see why the BBC or Bad Wolf or Russell T Davies would see that it's a mistake. They still got television out of it. The fact that Disney
they didn't get they didn't get
now,
continuing television out of
no,
it is the problem.
But I don't think that's necessarily a problem, other than for Doctor Who fans who want to see it on every.
Well, no, it's about being able to forward plan, isn't it? Prior to Disney, they had a deal with China that started in X year and ended in Y year. And they had a deal with America that started in X year and ended in Y year, and a deal with Australia, and so on and so forth, dozens of countries. And each of these deals started and ended at different times. And every time one of those deals ended, the other deals would keep Doctor Who and BBC Studios ticking along, and they would sort a new deal out with the country where the deal had ended. And so it continued. And for the best part of a decade, because this all started around the time that Stephen Moffat became showrunner, this is how it worked. BBC Studios were essentially making Doctor Who, and the BBC would pay in a certain amount. And as time went on, the amount that the BBC paid in would decrease, and the amount that they were getting from abroad would increase. The China deal was a big factor because that was a big deal. But as soon as they kicked all of those into touch, then they were into bed with Disney with a deal that would come to an end at a specific time, at which point they would lose all the money in one go. And if they didn't have something set up for afterwards, and this is the point with television production, you might be watching series 3 of a thing, but series 4 of a thing is already in production, and series 5 of a thing is in pre-production. And if your deal with Disney comes to an end and you've got no deal to set up afterwards, then you can't go into pre-production of the season that's 2 seasons hence. And so everything gets delayed by about 2 to 3 years.
It is a legitimate question, because the BBC were going for the bigger budget. They wanted Doctor Who to look on the same scale as the other Disney Plus productions, Star Wars, the Marvel stuff. And it's a question, is it that a mistake for Doctor Who? Does Doctor Who need to look like that? And is there that kind of misconception of Doctor Who in the higher, the old sixth floor of the BBC? Is that, does Doctor Who need to be that show? And
let's be honest, it didn't look like that, did it?
No, it was looking absolutely fine in the Chibnall era, to be honest. I thought that looked really good.
But also the Star Wars, I mean, Andor looks great, but it doesn't look that much different. They're still, as I said earlier privately, they're still filming in fields just outside Didcot or the promenade of Weston-super-Mare or wherever they went to. So
the point with Andor, though, is that when they go indoors, they go indoors into an environment that looks specific to Andor. Whereas with Doctor Who, when they go indoors, it looks like an environment that's specific to any program on any channel that you turn on, basically. And when you watch 60 minutes of Andor, the entire 60 minutes looks like nothing else other than Andor. But when you watch, I don't know, the Church on Ruby Road, 30 of those 60 minutes could have been EastEnders or Coronation Street or whatever. I think that's the difference. The Whoniverse. So they launched the Whoniverse as a kind of umbrella for Doctor Who. But this is like one of those things. During RTD-1, that sort of happened naturally, that you got spin-offs and you got the children's programs like Totally Doctor Who, and you got the cartoons and everything else. And all of these things were sort of part of this greater whole that sort of formed a Whoniverse without it being called that. It felt like with RTD-2, by launching this Whoniverse idea on the iPlayer, they were trying to push that idea rather than allowing it to happen. And that's only in the UK as well. So the iPlayer Whoniverse doesn't exist outside of the UK. And so a lot of the sort of side programming that goes alongside the program isn't available to viewers outside. This was a complaint that came up in a couple of places, just that the Hooniverse seems like an idea that needed to be organic rather than forced into position.
Well, I think there's two sides. There's two sides to the Hooniverse. There's the spin-off side, which, it wasn't quite as bad as the Universal Dark Universe spin-off, which they dramatically announced and then failed to make more than 2 films or 1 film. So there's the spin-off side, but there's also the getting everything into one place, which is the iPlayer, whether it's UK only or not. It doesn't really matter. They've successfully.
It kind of does if you're abroad and you want to watch everything.
It doesn't matter if you're talking about whether the Hooniverse idea is a success or not, because one of the missions of the Hooniverse is.
I'm not talking about whether the Hooniverse is a success. I'm asking whether the Hooniverse helps to make Doctor Who a success. And I'm pointing out that if Disney Plus have put a shed load of money in, and a lot of the sort of targeting of the program is towards something that's not available on Disney Plus, that in itself might be a problem. So, I mean, if Doctor Who is making and promoting programs that the viewers on Disney Plus can't even see, that's kind of.
It's doing like Tales of the TARDIS Pyramids of Mars version. That kind
of
thing.
Yeah. It's what I'm saying is there's just a lot of peripheral stuff that people are reading about on social media and then going online to watch, and it just isn't there. And most people reading this stuff on social media aren't thinking, oh, it's an iPlayer exclusive. They're just thinking, oh, I've read about this thing. I'll log on. And what I'm saying is that just doesn't give a good impression of the whole organization of the programming.
I mean, my impression is they did what they set out to do with the Hooniverse. It wasn't intended as a way of making the series great or promoting the series. It was getting everything into one place on the BBC iPlayer. And they kind of did that. I mean, it was a problem with Steph Colbert, and for some reason, Terror of the Zygons, that things started sort of.
It's the Robert Back Stewart estate, isn't it?
Yeah, but
it's more than just the back catalogue. The back catalogue's important. I think the back catalogue's vitally important that you get all that in the same place so that people can access it all from the same place. But like John says, it's also.
Yeah. Go on.
Well, it's also about Tales from the TARDIS and all the other peripheral stuff. The iPlayer Hooniverse has got a shed load of peripheral programming that RTD and the others were constantly mentioning in dispatches, and that people looking for it online just weren't able to find.
I think long term, though, it's a good move by Russell James and the BBC to have Doctor Who basically in one place, free to air, so you can go back and see it anytime. That kind of gives you, if you want Doctor Who, you can always find it now. Whether it's from 1960.
If you're in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. And the UK is kind of the vital place for it to survive.
And
very true.
The peripherals
market the material that's on the iPlayer. It's drawing people to the iPlayer. So Tales of the TARDIS referring, and the way Russell T Davies made the new series of the Shooty Gatwa series marketed the classic series as well. That's why he brings back Sutek, Rani.
But it's doing this at the time that you're in bed with Disney Plus, who doesn't have access to all of these things. So I'm not saying they didn't achieve what they wanted to achieve. Yeah. I'm just saying the thing that they wanted to achieve is at odds with what the BBC are trying to do, which is make Doctor Who a global brand through Disney Plus. The BBC are trying to make Doctor Who a global brand. Bad Wolf are very much trying to make Doctor Who a cottage industry in the UK, and those two things, to my mind, just don't necessarily sit too well together.
I mean, they don't contradict each other. They don't support each other necessarily, but they don't operate against each other. So what they're trying to do is have their cake and eat it. And what they didn't get was the Disney cake. Basically, that's what fell through.
But I think they should have just.
Maybe that's the television landscape. Instead of getting funding from here and there, you're getting funding from a monolithic streamer because they're all powerful at the moment. Maybe that's what the television landscape is. You get in bed with a streamer for 2, 3, 4 years, and then you have to spend a couple of years, 2 or 3, 4 years, trying to work out the next deal.
You worry about the consequences later.
Yeah, that's just the way it is.
But the odd thing about that is, yes, they're in bed with the streamer, but a fair amount of the programming they're making. They're making the Tales from the TARDIS at this time. They're making various documentaries and other programming at this time. And that stuff is not going on the streamer.
No.
And you say maybe the problem is, you say they're not at odds with each other, but they don't support each other. I think they should have supported each other. I think that's the whole point. These things should have.
Tales of the TARDIS isn't costing them a lot to make. So it's basically the equivalent of friend of the podcast Pete McTighe's Blu-ray trailers, isn't it? It's basically marketing material for the classic series. So I don't think whether it appears on Disney or not is kind of that important. The Blu-ray,
but it's an example of the mindset. It's an example of, if you make a decision that Doctor Who is going to be a BBC and Disney Plus program, then the way you produce Doctor Who should be that those two things support each other rather than being at odds with each other. And just, I don't know. We're still at the start of this list, though. We better move on, right? So, there are a lot of sort of little things that were niggles with people, like the sort of surface level messaging that wasn't necessarily always backed up by what was going on the screen. There's a lot of talk about trans issues, but for example, you only ever see female facing trans people. You never see male facing trans people. And then you get quotes in the dialogue, male presenting Time Lord being an acceptable thing, but you never see that backed up. And then you get a character like Rose who comes in to be an example of this thing that you're talking about, and you completely sideline her and remove all her agency and turn her into a character who barely has any dialogue at all after she's made a big introduction. And the stuff about, we've got a wheelchair ramp for the TARDIS and a character in a wheelchair who sits there looking at the wheelchair ramp and doesn't get invited to use it. There's a lot of talk that doesn't get backed up. That was an issue. I don't know if you want to say something about that, but we can move on. That's just something that came up.
I'd say there are clumsy missteps.
Yeah.
But on a whole, Ncuti Gatwa plays a properly queer version of the Doctor, a really kind of gender non-normal, I don't know what you want to call it, and the fact that he's not sort of, they don't sort of pin him down, they don't classify him, I think is a real strength of the series, because he just is.
It felt to me
a powerful thing.
Yeah, it felt to me like RTD had this idea to be more inclusive and more sort of diverse, but actually the only things he was actually able to put into the program were things that he'd experienced himself. So he wasn't able. So, for instance, he listened to what the people in wheelchairs said to him about how they should be more inclusive of wheelchairs, and he put it in the dialogue, but he didn't put it in the action. And so some of it feels very superficial because it gets talked about, but it doesn't become an actual part of the program.
Is this a problem with making TV? It's that's the kind of stuff it's gonna get lost unless it's vital to the action, and it never kind of feels vital to the action of the show.
It's because the only opportunity you have to put the wheelchair in the TARDIS is the exact moment that Russell T Davies just wants the two primary characters in the TARDIS to see it through each other's eyes.
It's a story conflicting with what he wants to do.
One more point about the wheelchair accessible TARDIS.
Yeah.
That presumably it wasn't just for Hujma Flip, the scientific advisor, whose name I said. It's for Bernard Cribbins, who unfortunately popped his clogs before he could go on the TARDIS.
I can think of an unfortunate thing.
Well, yeah, but I'd imagine that at some point in the Giggle, there would have been a scene intended for Bernard Cribbins to see the inside of the TARDIS rather than just be shot from the back.
Or even at the end, the end of Wild Blue Yonder.
Yeah.
Maybe.
He said he gets wheeled off under a cloak. Yeah.
But they could have made up for it, and they didn't make up for it in subsequent filming. So I don't know. It's a problem that stays there. I've said this before, and again, this is something that came up. You start your new era on Disney Plus with 3 episodes that are entirely based on sort of characters and plot lines from 2008. which is a weird thing. But also, then you go on to when you actually get the sort of bigger launch on Disney Plus. You start with a 3 episode launch, one of which has been sitting on the service for 3 months and is still part of this major launch. But also, a launch like that should show something of the sort of depth and the sort of broadness of Doctor Who. But actually, all 3 of those episodes are tonally very similar to each other. And maybe that also is an issue. So the launch is Church on Ruby Road, Space Babies, and Devil's Cord, which are all very in your face, very camp episodes. And so I think if that wasn't the kind of, it's not like if they'd have made that launch sort of an episode like the Church on Ruby Road and an episode more like Boom, the Stephen Moffat one, an episode more like Rogue, the sort of romantic historical drama one. If they'd have done that, people might have watched those 3 episodes and thought, oh, this is a really interesting program. But the thing is, if you rubbed up against the tone of Church on Ruby Road, and 2 hours later you're watching the end of Devil's Cord and you're still rubbing up against that same tone, I think it doesn't show any imagination in the launch.
It is kind of what I do think is the problem with the Russell J series, which was the structure of the seasons. I think it's generally a solid thing, but the opening of Russell T Davies season are always kind of lighter episodes. He's always looking to draw an audience in, not hit them with anything too hard. So those first few episodes, I mean, particularly with the way it was structured, the first, Devil's Cord and Space Babies dropped on the same day. So they were almost designed to kind of dovetail like that.
It might be a problem with Rose, oddly, weirdly, because Rose is quite a light
Yeah.
story. It's quite fun and comedic, but it was the first thing people had seen in Doctor Who since 1996.
Yeah.
So Rose had the advantage of being completely new and fresh.
And also, actually, just to before
on.
you go on, but to add to your point, The End of the World had been written to go out as a double header with Rose, and then they put them back.
Yeah. So Rose is actually very similar to Smith and Jones and Partners in Crime. The problem Russell T Davies thing had, I assume, is he thought he could do Rose again, but now we've had first part Doctor Who's episodes for 15, 20 years, and so it's not new. You have to do something different. However, I think treating those 3 Tennant episodes as the launch, as the big launch, I think that kind of works because I think they are kind of big and spectacular. I don't think in the feel of them it's going back to 2008. I think they are fresh. I think the mistake is possibly bringing Tennant back or replacing Jodie Whittaker with Tennant, because you've had a sort of fresh Doctor who's really popular with kids and the first female Doctor, and then you regenerate her into David Tennant. It's a sort of a cynical Boris Johnson move.
And it's somebody you've regenerated into somebody who's going to appeal to people in their 40s rather than people who are 14, right?
But it worked because they were really popular. Those 3 episodes were really popular.
And it's an anniversary. You always have a past Doctor or 2 back on an anniversary.
Well,
you sure do. It's an accident of the timing, and I've said this all along. It's an accident of the timing, but that still doesn't mean that it's not a mistake. That the timing itself isn't a mistake. That the Disney Plus era starts with something that's kind of so backwards looking. When
I think the problem with Space Babies is that RTD's previous kind of season openers, they all sort of, apart from New Earth, maybe.
Well, John, the season opener on Disney Plus is the Church on Ruby Road, not Space Babies.
Yeah, but the UK launch, it was Space Babies, and that is kind of a second episode. It's not. There's no hook to it like it was most of the RTD season openers. They introduce new characters or a new partnership and set them off. This isn't really introducing anything because you've already seen the new guys come in and the start of it. It's like you're starting off with in the UK with a part 2 of a series rather than part 1, which I think is possibly an issue with it. It's not as big an episode as you need, and you can see that in the reaction to it, which has been pretty universally awful.
Maybe that's the problem with Church of Ruby Road. Needed to be a standalone Ncuti Gatwa
Yeah, either
story
that
where
or
you kind of tell his story and then it leads into him meeting
you draw or
Ruby.
you needed that series, the series to launch in January, just after the Church on Ruby Road.
Um, Keeping us moving. By generation, obviously, was a big issue with fans. I liked the bi generation in that it gave a science fiction rationale for the two doctors to exist at the same time. And I like what they do with David Tennant, and I feel it's fully justified that he just goes off and he's not a adventuring doctor anymore because, as I said, you can rationalize it that the TARDIS just never takes him into danger anymore. Whatever, it doesn't matter. It felt to me like a rational and emotionally rational storyline. It's the fact that RTD then goes on social media and interviews and stuff to say that every regeneration now is a bi regeneration. And then he sort of kind of alludes to the fact that there'll be an explanation for it later. And there sort of is, but the explanation that he does give for it later is kind of woolly.
I mean,
So,
there's two ways of thinking about it. Every regeneration after this point is by generation, but what he's actually saying is every regeneration that's happened in the past is
yeah,
by generation,
in
which
order
kind
to
of gives
allow
a
for tales of the TARDIS, right?
yeah, which is kind of a cute. I mean, I know
Yeah.
the actors who played the old Doctors are still talking about it. I know this for a fact because I heard them talking about it with each other about how they can kind of just carry on being the Doctor, and it explains the
Yeah.
curator and it explains the aging of the Doctors. So it's
And they
kind of
could just come back as you want. So he could do whatever he wants with the characters as they are now.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of
It's
cute.
perfectly
I mean,
good. It's a good
fun,
in production terms. It's a really smart move.
and it means McGann can come back for his miniseries.
But by sort of expanding it beyond that one, it kind of takes a lot of the peril and tension out of the program. Unless it gets undone later, and it doesn't get undone later, the kind of explanation for it is with all the Time Lords missing, we need some way to reproduce. And that kind of gets into the area of inbreeding or even possibly eugenics and stuff. It's such a weird explanation to give it.
It might be undone by the end of the year.
Well, who
Because
knows? Yeah,
that
yeah.
regeneration we saw was not a or possible regeneration we saw was not a bi-generation.
But it's an odd thing, and it feeds into this point that I think is something that was kind of one of the overriding thoughts amongst a lot of the complaints, and it was sort of voiced in lots of different ways. So I'll try and voice it in a way that kind of makes sense of all of the complaints. But it's that, and we talked about it a lot at the time, where RTD says that there's gods now, so we're leaning into fantasy. But the trouble with fantasy is if you want the program to be fantasy because you want the program to be fantastical, that's one thing. But if you want the program to be fantasy because you don't want to be bothered by the rules that would govern it if it was rational, then that's something else. And I think the trouble with RTD2 is a lot of the time it just wasn't governed by rational rules. And so it felt like there's always been a problem with Doctor Who that the first three quarters of any story are great and the ending's always a bit underwhelming. But if you deliberately set out to make the ending underwhelming, then that's not going to be very helpful, is it?
I didn't see RTD2 as being particularly irrational or being particularly fantastical. It felt like
Well,
it
then
was
he
a
failed because that's what he wanted.
RTD1 felt like it was drawing on the Pertwee years a little bit, that kind of grounded Pertwee years. RTD2 felt like he was drawing on all the rest of Doctor Who. So Troughton, McCoy, and we've always had. There's no difference between RTD2 and Greatest Show in the Galaxy or the Mind Robber or Celestial Toymaker. So
I
it's not really
there's
it's
a
not
but
really a
there's
big
a
shift from Doctor Who.
but there is an emphasis thing. There is an emphasis. So you talk about the Mind Robber and the Celestial Toymaker. Those are once a Doctor stories, but they now become twice or three times a season stories. So there is definitely a shift in emphasis.
Not emphasis so much as there's arc storylines, which we know that happened in the modern series, and the arc storylines happen to be about the Greatest Show in the Galaxy, Fenric, celestial toy maker type figures.
And
I mean, that's
I wouldn't argue that the rules are all, there is no plot logic to it. It's more, there are different rules now. The gods are all kind of have to play by certain rules. And part of the show is figuring that out again.
and they're the
I
best
don't
story.
know.
They are the best stories as well
Yeah.
in these episodes. One thing about By Generation, I did think it lost something. So David Tennant and Ncuti Gatwa appearing on screen at the same time. There is a sort of poignancy to something like Castrovalva or the 11th Hour that you don't see the previous Doctor, and even Deep Breath, where you do see the previous Doctor. That moment, I know JR, you don't like it, but the moment where Capaldi phones up,
I don't mind that it exists. I don't think it was executed very
no,
well.
but it still gives the sort of it plays on that poignancy where you're not expecting to see the previous Doctor, and suddenly you do, and it gives you an emotional kind of, or it's intended to give you an emotional punch, and
It's
you
kind of
lose.
appropriate to do with Tennant's Doctor because he had that whole thing about not wanting to go and the new man walks away. So it allows him to walk away as well. So it is kind of healing himself
Yeah,
or
but you
that
see,
at the
there
same
is a
time.
sort of there's that which replaces the kind of the melancholy
Yeah.
in By Generation, but I kind of miss the melancholy as well. There, you
Yeah.
know,
I mean, the thing with Biogeneration was the optics of it. It's that they've chosen this new one for the first full-time Black Doctor,
Hmm.
and you do kind
yeah,
of go,
carefully
is this
put.
guy the second fiddle to the Tenant? That is poor optics, I think, and it's a case of what they want to do and what they are doing kind of jarring a little.
Well, poor optics in the same way that Jodie Whittaker regenerating into David Tennant was
Yeah,
I
slightly
think that was the
jarring.
poorer optics. I mean, when Ncuti Gatwa turns up, he saves the day, not David Tennant. So the optics are the other way round, really. You can only see the optics as being poor in that case if you want the
but you
optics
go,
to look poor.
well,
I
you
think
can,
he
but some
has
people
he
will.
has
Some
more
people will read it like
he
that.
has more agency, but he also shares. There's a sort of a I think
Yes.
he shares the screen
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and that's you have a leading man, a new leading man who shares the screen with the old leading man, and they're co-leads for that period of time.
I think maybe the issue, as fans, the issue is that normally we're used to saying goodbye to somebody and saying hello to somebody,
Yeah.
and being able to do those things at separate times.
Yes,
Apart from the actual moment of regeneration, you
and
tend to get a break before you do
you
the
can
other
tell
one.
that that's a poignant moment because of all these stories of Matt Smith walking onto set and
Yeah.
David Tennant walking off set. That's actually quite a big moment. Or even McGann and
McCoy.
McCoy
Mm.
having the sort of the photograph session of handing over the keys. There is a handover of roles, and any sort of fuzziness between those, particularly on screen, I think, kind of delegitimizes it slightly. It sort of reduces the impact slightly.
Um, Russell T Davies comes back, and the first companion he chooses is somebody who's basically an identikit Rose. That's not basically a major one, but I thought it was worth bringing up. It just it felt to me like Russell T Davies comes back with a slight lack of imagination, and I think this is just an example of a lack of imagination.
Yeah, it is the same Rolls Royce. It's someone who wants someone to show the wonder of the universe to. So
Yeah, yeah.
his audience point of view is he wants you to be wowed by that.
But it is essentially another 20-year-old shop girl, isn't it? To all intents and purposes, from
Or
a
even younger, yeah, late
yeah,
teen, early 20, yeah, it's same position in life really.
from a family where there's a mother and no father. Once
I mean,
again,
it is a lack of imagination. It's Russell T Davies came back, and he's brought Doctor Who back once, and he brought it back in arguably the perfect way. So how do you bring it back? How do you create another perfect way? And so he does the same thing he did before, but
well,
unfortunately, 20 years later,
it's not what's
it's
needed, is
not
it?
a
The
perfect
world
way
has
anymore. It's
changed, yeah.
not
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the same world, the same country, the same television set.
Okay, here's two or three different things that are sort of wrapped up as part of the same thing. So I'll say them all for what they are, and we'll try and tease it out. There's a lack of recognizable returning villains. So you don't get Daleks, you don't get Cybermen, you don't get Sontarans, you don't get Ice Warriors or Ood or whatever. And that's part of the continuity of Doctor Who. So part of the continuity of Doctor Who, when I say continuity, I don't mean in the sort of finicky kind of fanish way, but part of the sort of, the bread and butter, the bones of Doctor Who. Part of that is missing, which means that there's a part of this sort of 2 years, this sort of two shooting Gatwick seasons, that doesn't feel like Doctor Who because you don't see Daleks and you expect Daleks. And if you expect things, even if you're not conscious of the fact that you're expecting them and you don't see them, then interiorly it feels like there's something missing. But what he replaces with it instead is, and he's always done this throughout the RTD1, there always was a brand new returning character in each season. And even if you count the specials as a season, then it's Rassilon, right? So you've still got a sort of returning. So he brings back these returning characters. And so the complaint here is that whereas if the Daleks would come back, they would be a major part of it and you would treat them as Daleks. But instead here, you're bringing back Omega and Sutek and the Rani. And the complaint is, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but they're just brought back for the sake of having the name rather than it actually being the character that people remember.
It feels like a flaw in planning, because you get the impression that Russell T Davies is playing a 5-year
maybe
plan, not realizing, gambling on the popularity of the series and the continuation of the series. And that makes perfect sense. If he's playing a 5-year plan, bringing the Daleks back this Christmas or next season in a big way, bringing the Cybermen back, sort of delaying them for that long, makes perfect sense because you're slowly building towards it. The problem is he's slowly building towards something that he never actually reaches, which is a bit sad, because also I really liked the god stuff and felt like it was, had room to carry on, and maybe we'd see Fenric or Ragnarok or whatever. But he ran out of road.
Yeah. John, any thoughts about the sort of absence of the Daleks or the way that Sutek or Omega were treated? I think individually, all of those characters actually were treated in ways that were sort of appropriate to the characters.
I thought the Omega one was hilarious. It was
Yeah.
brilliant.
But you can see why
it was a lack of
fans as a whole
respect
had a
on
problem.
that,
Yeah.
which I'm fine with. Which you need to have as a writer. You need to see them as what works for the story. What can I do with them? And you're not worried about breaking the toys afterwards. I was absolutely fine with them. I
I
do
wonder
think,
if I wonder if fandom as a whole might have been finer with them if you'd have had Cyberman and Dalek stories as
yeah.
well.
I mean, the only recognised monsters who come back, a new series new series guys would recognise would be the Silurians, and they're only obviously a character in Joy to the World.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
So yeah, I think it would have benefited to find a familiar face somewhere, because that is always something you can sell to an audience. The problem is with the audience, once you've sold them, the new Doctor with the new queer Doctor, the new kind of set up the universe, you kind of need that little boost, because that's what he did in the first place with Dalek. Was in case it wasn't working, you drop the Daleks in who would recognise the icons. I think that would, certainly in the UK, would have benefited a kind of a mid-season episode.
Plus, I think there's a case to be made that if you cast a new actor as the Doctor and a new actor as the companion, and you build the interior of the TARDIS again, and you give him a new sonic screwdriver, yes, all of those things are things that you can say are part of Doctor Who. But actually, because all of them are new versions of those things, you need to see something like the Daleks to cement these new things as part of the universe.
Well,
Otherwise, there's a way in which they perhaps feel a bit ersatz, a bit like they're not part of the universe until you bring them in.
well, I think with pretty much all the Doctors, aside from I think it's Colin Baker and Matt Smith, and then Jodie, they all have familiar elements around them. So you are reassured that this is a new Doctor. You don't ever have that in the shoot era, I don't think. So you never kind of get his measure against the Doctor by going, oh, Doctor's been up against these guys before. how does he deal with them?
You've got Unit, I suppose.
Yeah, but they're only in that. They're only in
Yeah,
that
they turn up at
final.
the
Yeah,
finale. Yeah, yeah,
finales.
I
Yeah,
mean,
and that.
it's also the Weeping Angels. Russell T Davies is still the only modern showrunner who hasn't written the
yeah,
Weeping Angels, and Weeping Angels, possibly more than the Daleks, would do that cementing
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because they're, arguably more popular or more recognizable now than the Daleks.
Yeah, totally. And or even the Ood. He created the Ood. He could have brought the Ood back, and even that would have given that sense of continuity. Because it's all very well saying this is the 15th Doctor, and this is the same universe. But you've also got to make people feel that as well as being told that. And I think by not having any of those recognizable monsters, I think that just diminishes that a bit. Um, as for the shooting out with Doctor's character, so I mean, this is an emphasis thing as well. Again, there was all this talk about how he cries in every episode. I don't think the Doctor crying is a problem. I think the Doctor crying in every episode is a problem because then it just becomes, when's he going to cry this week? And it loses all impact. But I think when the complaint is made that the Doctor's crying in every episode, because part of that as well in a lot of what I was reading is that the Doctor's often scared rather than commanding. And I think, and also you've got in Rogue, he falls in love so quickly. And then that character comes back in a way that doesn't resolve that storyline. I think the complaint is that Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor is a lot of the time a passenger in his own series. He's not the one solving things. He's not the one with the agency. He's not the one who walks into the room and sorts things out. Other people are sorting things out on his behalf. And so you've
But
got a
that was
lot
a
of.
complaint leveled at Eccleston as well, and that
It
was a very
was,
deliberate element of the script.
but he solved it with the David Tennant Doctor. And here it feels like an accidental choice. It feels like he wanted to make a more emotional Doctor. And
Yes,
we live
he's
in,
very mercurial
but we
as a
live in more
performance.
emotional times, which is fine. But it felt like there were points, or it felt like to a lot of people making the complaints, I think, more than to me personally, that there were points at which they thought that he'd gone too much into the emotional life of the Doctor and forgotten who and what the Doctor is in terms of his place in the program. I'm just getting nods now instead of.
Oh no,
Yeah, it's
it felt.
possible.
I was thinking back over past Doctors. It feels like Capaldi is the one that stands out as the kind of the actual sort of traditional Doctor who isn't very emotional, very quite repressed, angry, and it feels like Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor as a reaction against that rather than a contrast with Jodie Whittaker.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and normally you seek a contrast with the Doctor that's gone before, and I'm not counting the David Tennant and the Regnum. But the problem with
Yeah.
the great thing about Jodie Whittaker was on the surface she had that sort of emotional engagement, albeit tempered by a slight unreliability.
Yeah, there was.
She was kind of meant to be neurodiverse, wasn't she?
Yeah, yeah.
And also
So
an unreliable narrator of her own story. So a lot of the time during the start of the Chibnall era, we thought that she was telling her own story too much, but it kind of became apparent that there was slightly a reason for that. And she kept talking about flat management structures and the fam and all this kind of stuff. But when it came down to it, she was still a Doctor who was separate from the companions emotionally and sort of in terms of, the power structure. But and I guess this feeds into this sort of final point. So there's two or three final points here, and I guess this what we've just been talking about kind of feeds into this a bit, and I think they're all related. So is the way. So one of the complaints is, or not a complaint, but an observation is in losing Millie Gibson. And they definitely lost Millie Gibson. And, we've never got to the bottom of what happened, but it's absolutely clear from the way the narrative unfolds that Millie Gibson was supposed to be across both seasons. And somehow they've lost her.
well, she was interviewed on stage by a certain Radio Free Skaro alumni at Gallifrey. I think it
He's
was
not an alumni,
established.
he's still there.
Yeah, it's close enough. He's not there this week, is he? They've had to cancel this week. They're off the air. But
No, they're
yeah,
not off air. We're pre-recording something
she
that
only
they've had
found
to.
out she was off when she got the script for those episodes, the finale. So
It's clear that the series 2 or the series 15 resolution was supposed to be about Millie Gibson's character, Ruby
yeah,
Sunday. And it's clear that something happened. I thought it made that last episode absolutely sensationally sort of, you know,
it's fascinating, isn't it, in storytelling
yes,
terms?
I think so. And I think actually, I think the story that he comes up with is better than the one that we heard, that there was lots of rumors about that was supposed to be the story. But it does mean that there are lots of kind of loose ends and things that don't make sense. And I'm not talking about sort of plot things that don't make any sense logically. I'm talking about just things in the production that don't make sense, like the Millie Gibson factor. And so you've got all that stuff about introducing Susan so that you can do something with Susan, and then she just disappears. And I think the way she disappears actually works, but it's clear watching it that that's not what was supposed to happen. But also going back to what I was just saying about the 15th Doctor sort of becoming a passenger in his own storyline, I think the way sees the second series ends just compounds that, because it's clear that he was supposed to have something more to do in that story. And in the end, he becomes this person who's watching the story unfolding around him.
It's alumnus is the singular, by the way.
It is.
Yeah.
You look like you were desperate to say something.
Well,
I was trying to get to the end of my sentence so you could say it, and it was
I've worked with universities for 25 years, so it's important to get these things right. Alumna is a female singular. Alumnus is male singular. Alumni is plural. I
wanted to be a judge. I never had the Latin.
I think most of these issues, as you're suggesting, are an issue with Disney Plus bailing. And if we'd got 5 series, we wouldn't have noticed necessarily that Millie Gibson gets the heave ho. We might have thought, oh, that finale didn't work so well. But look at them really cementing this Doctor companion relationship in season 3, 4, and 5, and how great it is. Look at how Ncuti Gatwa develops his character and really gains sort of like mercurial ambiguity in terms of his relationship with. But it doesn't happen.
No, but I think it is noticeably doesn't happen. So I don't think you can ignore it. I think it makes for fascinating TV.
But I think if you take an abstract if you took just the Eccleston series and said that was it for Doctor Who, you might think, well, they got rid of him quite quickly. That didn't really work. Or take the first 2 Matt Smith seasons as a sort of a singular.
But it's slightly different because that first Eccleston series does work as a self-contained story, whereas seasons 14 and 15 here with Ncuti Gatwa were supposed to be a relatively self-contained story about a character who's only in the first of those 2 seasons and then essentially disappears. And so the story changes and you can feel the grinding of the gears as the story changes.
And I can see it in Belinda having no character outside her job.
Yeah, when she came in, everybody thought she was great. And then 4 episodes later, everybody wondered what on earth had happened.
It's a fantastic performance because there's nothing to work with.
Yeah.
It feels a bit like Bill, to be honest with you. Bill had that, and I love that season, but Bill had that kind of, we need a companion for 1 season, let's bring her in, or Freema Agyeman as well.
Actually,
you need a companion for a single season, let's bring in.
Everybody forgets, but Lie of the Land is a perfect, brilliant last episode for Bill, because the resolution to that story is everything to do with her, how her family works, how her memories work, and how the science fiction impacts around her. I think Lie of the Land is incredibly underrated, and the resolution to it, I think, is one of Doctor Who's best moments. But then you go on.
That got lost with the regeneration thing, didn't it?
Yeah, exactly. People concentrate on that and forget the rest of the story, which is great.
Thing is, you could say that the Doctor might be regenerating from that point onwards until the end of the season. Because if it's real, what if he's just holding it back?
But the point is, Bill then goes on to have a final story where she's robbed of any agency, right? And that's the problem. And the same is true, obviously, of Belinda in this second season here. It feels like these 2 seasons are the whole of series 10, sort of spread out across 2 years rather than compacted into 8 episodes. It clearly doesn't work. Like I've said it twice already in this episode, I think it makes for absolutely fascinating television. And I really enjoyed the way that season ended because of it. Because actually, I think RTD makes a better ending for those characters and for that season than the ending he had planned. I think it's much more interesting that that child becomes this baby that's been created out of basically nothing rather than a baby who. So this baby is conjured up out of nothing and then becomes a real person, and the universe has to bend to accommodate that baby. I think that's a much more interesting storyline than the one he had planned. But yeah, but you know, but at the same time, you can tell that that's not the story he had planned, and so a lot of the other stuff that he had building up to that just kind of feels like it doesn't quite sit into place.
Yeah, it's the overall structure is what doesn't work about the seasons for me. That's the main thing. And it's part of the artifact of making TV and things changing. He
Yeah, yeah,
does
yeah.
accommodate it, but it's all very messy and therefore very fascinating. I think we're going to be talking about them for a long, long time, even
Well,
if
like I
Doctor Who comes
said,
back next year.
when we started talking, it's all about putting out fires, isn't it? But not having the hubris to think that you won't have fires to put out, which is obviously a great place for us to stop. Although the story itself isn't finished as well, of course. There's one more RTD episode to come. So I guess we'll be reiterating some of these conversations when we get there. However, for now, I was JR.
I was John.
I was Matt.
And we will speak again soon. I don't think I recorded that. Or did I? I don't know.
The
Oh,
lady's
that
voice said recording.